It began on a warm Saturday morning, the kind where the sun filtered through the trees and the neighborhood felt deceptively peaceful. My property sat at the edge of the cul-de-sac, a place where I had carved out a little corner of tranquility. I'd been living there for nearly 5 years without so much as a whisper of conflict. My backyard, spacious and vibrant, had always been my sanctuary. It was where I planted my vegetables, tended to my garden, and enjoyed the simple satisfaction of watching things grow. That spring, I decided to add something new to my little ecosystem: chickens. I wasn't looking to start a business or make a statement. I just wanted a few hens for fresh eggs and the comforting rhythm of caring for them. Chickens were quiet, easy, and useful. For me, it was another step towards self-sufficiency and a lifestyle that felt wholesome and rewarding. I built a small coop tucked neatly into the corner of the yard, gave them a safe enclosure, and kept everything clean and orderly. But in neighborhoods ruled by HOAs, peace rarely lasted. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of every unwritten law, and the reigning queen of the HOA board, noticed my chickens almost immediately. She lived 2 houses down and had a perfect line of sight into my backyard from her upstairs window. For someone who always seemed to have binoculars on hand and an insatiable thirst for control, the sight of my little flock was an opportunity she couldn't resist. It wasn't long before a letter appeared in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA, a logo. It was written in stiff, formal language, citing violations of community standards regarding unauthorized livestock. Attached was a fine, $200. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. The chickens weren't loud, weren't messy, and were no different from the countless pets that neighbors kept. There was no rule in the HOA bylaws explicitly forbidding them, yet here it was, a fine for disrupting community harmony. I knew exactly who was behind it: Karen. For a moment I considered paying the fine just to avoid conflict. That was, after all, what the HOA thrived on, residents giving in to avoid trouble. But the more I thought about it, the more the injustice burned. Why should I give in to Karen's petty power trip? Why should I have to bend to her will when I wasn't breaking any rules? That night, I walked into the backyard under the soft glow of the porch light. The chickens clucked softly in their coop, calm and content. I felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about a fine. This was about standing up to a system, and to Karen, that thrived on intimidation and control. Instead of paying the fine, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't just keep the chickens, I would expand. If Karen thought a few hens were a violation, she had no idea what was coming. In the weeks that followed, I started small. I expanded the chicken run, adding more space for them to roam. I brought in a couple of ducks, partly because they were useful for pest control, and partly because I knew it would gnaw at Karen to see something new. I cleared a section of my yard for a larger vegetable garden, planting neat rows of tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. My backyard was slowly evolving from a modest suburban lawn into something far greater. And all the while, Karen watched. I could feel her glare from her window, her eyes like spotlights searching for infractions. She wasn't just annoyed, she was enraged. For someone who thrived on control, seeing her authority challenged in plain sight was intolerable. The second letter came a week later. Another fine, this time for $300, accusing me of expanding unapproved agricultural activity. Again, it was baseless. There were no HOA rules that prohibited vegetable gardens or small poultry. It was all Karen's interpretation, her desperate attempt to force me into submission. I didn't pay it. Instead, I doubled down. I researched local ordinances, county rules, and state laws. Everything I was doing was perfectly legal. The HOAs My laws were vague at best, and nowhere did it give them authority to regulate something as simple as chickens. Karen had built her empire on bluffing, and I had just called her bluff. By the end of that month, my backyard had transformed. The garden had expanded into raised beds, neat and thriving with fresh green shoots. I added a small goat pen, complete with a charming little shelter. The goats were quiet, friendly, and perfectly allowed under local law. A compost bin sat neatly in the corner, turning scraps into rich fertilizer. What had started as a backyard hobby was evolving into a fully functional microfarm. The neighborhood began to notice. Some residents were curious, stopping by to ask about the garden or watch the goats. Children loved visiting, their laughter filling the air as they fed chickens or watched ducks waddle across the lawn. Not everyone approved, of course, but many were quietly supportive. After all, I wasn't just defying Karen. I was creating something beautiful. Karen, however, was spiraling. Her letters became more aggressive, her fines steeper, her threats louder. She ranted about property values and neighborhood standards, insisting that my farm was a blight on the community. But the truth was undeniable. My property was neat, organized, and thriving. Nothing about it was a violation, except, in Karen's mind, as summer stretched on, the tension grew thicker. Karen wasn't used to losing battles, and she wasn't about to let this go without a fight. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't just resisting, I was planning. Because this was no longer about chickens or goats or gardens. This was about turning my yard into something so big, so undeniable, that not even Karen and not even the HOA could stop it. And so, as the sun set behind my growing farm, I knew one thing for certain. The war with Karen had only just begun. The first. Cracks in Karen's facade appeared not long after I refused to pay the second fine. She had always prided herself on being the enforcer, the self-proclaimed guardian of order within the HOA. But the sight of my farm in progress, growing stronger each week, began to erode her confidence. To Karen, it wasn't just a garden or a few animals. It was a direct challenge to her authority, and challenges in her world had to be crushed. By midsummer, my backyard was unrecognizable from its earlier state. The chickens had multiplied, clucking contentedly as they pecked at the soil. The ducks paddled in a small pond I had dug near the back fence, quacking softly in the evenings. The goats grazed happily in their pen, their gentle bleats echoing across the yard. Vegetables grew in abundance, rows of vibrant green stretching outward like a miniature farm carved into suburban land. Neighbors who once passed by without a second glance now slowed their steps to admire the transformation. Some even began to drop by, offering seeds, compost, or simply words of encouragement. A small community was forming around what I had built, and in a strange way, my farm was becoming a symbol of freedom. A reminder that not every square inch of our lives had to be dictated by HOA rules and the whims of people like Karen. Karen, however, was not impressed. Her campaign escalated quickly. One morning, I found not just a letter in my mailbox, but an entire packet. Inside were photographs of my backyard, taken from angles that could only have come from her second-story window, along with pages of alleged violations. She claimed my farm created unsanitary conditions, noise disturbances, and visual disharmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. She even went so far as to suggest that my goats were a health hazard. At the bottom of the packet sat a new fine, $500. I laughed when I saw it, not because it wasn't outrageous, but because I knew I wasn't beaten. I had done my homework. The local ordinances were crystal clear. My animals were legal, my garden was permitted, and nothing about my setup violated any actual law. The HOA bylaws, vague as they were, had no authority to override city and county rules. Karen was bluffing, and every fine she issued was nothing more than a piece of paper meant to scare me. But Karen wasn't satisfied with paper threats. She wanted a spectacle. It began with an emergency HOA board meeting. Flyers were slipped under doors and pinned to mailboxes, calling residents to gather at the community center on a Tuesday evening. The agenda was clear: discussion of unauthorized farming activities. I went not because I had to, but because I knew Karen wanted me there. She wanted an audience for her accusations, a stage on which to perform her outrage. The meeting was crowded, more residents than I had ever seen gather for HOA business. Karen stood at the front of the room, papers in hand, her voice shrill with indignation as she outlined her case. She called my farm an eyesore, a nuisance, and a threat to property values. She waved photos around like evidence. In a courtroom, each one carefully chosen to make my backyard look chaotic rather than organized. For nearly half an hour, she ranted. When she finally paused, I calmly stood. I didn't need theatrics. I simply stated the facts. Everything I was doing was legal, within my rights, and beneficial to the community. I cited ordinances, quoted bylaws, and reminded everyone that my property was maintained in excellent condition. I explained how neighbors had come to enjoy fresh vegetables, eggs, and even the company of the animals. And then I said something that visibly shook Karen. This isn't a violation. This is growth, and it's only the beginning. The room buzzed. Some residents clapped quietly, others whispered to one another. Karen's face turned red, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't used to being challenged publicly, and certainly not used to losing control of the narrative. The board, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, decided to review the situation further rather than issue an immediate ruling. In reality, they had no power to stop me. They knew it, and Karen knew it. But she wasn't going to give up. From that moment, her war became personal. She began calling animal control, health inspectors, and even zoning officers. Each time, officials arrived at my property, clipboard in hand, only to find that everything was in perfect order. My permits were valid, my animals healthy, my yard clean. They left, empty-handed, sometimes even shaking their heads at the absurdity of the complaints. Each failed attempt only fueled Karen's frustration. Her obsession grew. I saw her peering from behind curtains, pacing in her yard, snapping photos whenever I so much as stepped outside. She scribbled furiously in a notebook, as if documenting every move I made. She was unraveling, and the more she tried to tighten her grip, the looser her control became. Meanwhile, my farm flourished. I expanded the garden again, adding berry bushes along the fence line. I built a small greenhouse for herbs and leafy greens, its clear panels glinting in the sun. The goats thrived, playful and strong, drawing smiles from passing children. I even added a beehive, carefully managed to produce honey and pollinate. The garden, what Karen saw as a nightmare, others began to see as a blessing. Neighbors stopped by more frequently, curious and supportive. Some brought their kids, who eagerly fed the chickens or watched the bees at work. Slowly, the community began to shift. Where Karen had tried to sow fear, I had sown something different, inspiration. But Karen wasn't done. Late one evening, as the crickets chirped and the farm settled into its nightly calm, I received a thick envelope in the mail. This one wasn't from the HOA, it was from a law firm. Karen had escalated again. This time she was threatening to sue. The war was about to enter a whole new battlefield. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, its sharp edges cutting into my palm as I carried it inside. I already knew what it was before I opened it. Karen had been reaching for bigger weapons ever since her fines failed, and this was her boldest move yet. Inside, crisp legal letterhead glared back at me, a notice of intent to sue. According to the letter, Karen, backed by a handful of equally bitter board members, was threatening legal action for creating unsafe living conditions, reducing property values, and causing emotional distress to neighbors. It was an impressive collection of baseless claims, all tied neatly together with the demand that I remove my farm immediately or face a lawsuit in civil court. For most people, this might have been enough to break their resolve. Legal battles are intimidating, expensive, and exhausting. Karen was counting on exactly that. She thought the fear of court costs and endless hearings would drive me into compliance. But Karen underestimated two things: my stubbornness and my preparation. Had spent months researching my rights, digging through ordinances, and consulting professionals. I had documented every step of my farm's growth with photos, receipts, and permits. I had kept records of neighbors' support, their visits, their appreciation for the fresh eggs and vegetables. And perhaps most importantly, I had already consulted an attorney when Karen's harassment began escalating. So when I laid the letter on the table, I didn't feel panic. I felt clarity. The next morning I called my lawyer, a calm and methodical man who had seen more HOA battles than most judges. He read the letter carefully, then chuckled. "Empty threats," he said, sliding the papers back across the desk. "They can file a lawsuit if they want, but they don't have a leg to stand on. You're within your rights. Still, we didn't take chances." He drafted a response, polite yet firm, outlining the legality of every aspect of my farm. He cited ordinances, health codes, and zoning laws. He pointed out the frivolous nature of Karen's claims and made it clear that if she proceeded, we would not only fight, but countersue for harassment. That letter was sent back to the HOA within 48 hours. For a brief moment, things grew. Quiet. Karen wasn't used to resistance, let alone legal resistance. I imagine she read my lawyer's response with clenched fists, her carefully laid plans unraveling before her eyes. But quiet never lasted long with Karen. If she couldn't, a win in court, she would try to win in public opinion. Soon, whispers spread through the neighborhood. Karen cornered residents during evening walks, spinning tales of disease, noise, and chaos spilling from my farm. She claimed my goats carried illnesses, that my bees would sting children, that my chickens were attracting rodents. She painted a picture of disaster, one designed to turn neighbor against neighbor. But something unexpected happened. Instead of siding with Karen, many neighbors began defending me. They had seen the farm with their own eyes. They had tasted fresh vegetables, collected eggs with their children, even enjoyed jars of honey I had shared. They knew the truth, and it didn't match Karen's version of events. The divide in the community grew sharper. Karen and her small circle of supporters grew louder, more desperate, but the majority seemed indifferent or quietly supportive of what I had built. For the first time, Karen wasn't leading the conversation. She was fighting to control it. Meanwhile, my farm continued to expand. The greenhouse flourished with herbs and greens, its humid warmth a sanctuary against the summer heat. The berry bushes ripened, drawing children to pick them straight from the branches. The goats grew stronger, playful and docile, becoming local favorites. Even the bees, once a point of fear, began to fascinate neighbors as they learned about pollination and honey production. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood in my yard and watched families gather near the fence. Children fed chickens handfuls of grain, while parents chatted about gardening tips. It was surreal. A vision of community, of cooperation, arising from what had begun as a petty fine. But Karen wasn't done. If lawsuits and gossip couldn't tear down my farm, she would escalate again. The following week, I awoke to flashing lights outside my house. A county health inspector had arrived, clipboard in hand, responding to yet another anonymous complaint. Karen was relentless, her campaign of harassment escalating into near-daily assaults. The inspector walked the property with me, checking pens, feed storage, and water systems. He scribbled notes, asked questions, and inspected every corner of the farm. In the end, his conclusion was simple. Everything was in perfect compliance. He even complimented the cleanliness of the goat pen and the organization of the garden. When he left, I caught a glimpse of Karen standing at her window, her curtain twitching as she watched. I could almost feel the fury radiating from her. Every attempt she made to crush me only made me stronger. Every complaint she filed became another clean inspection record in my favor. And still, I wasn't done expanding. If Karen wanted to play the long game, so would I. I began planning an orchard. Along the back edge of the property, small fruit trees that would one day tower over the fence line. I researched permits for a larger greenhouse, one that could produce vegetables year-round. I even considered adding a second beehive to increase honey production. Each new idea was like fuel to my determination. Karen had started this war with a $200 fine, believing she could force me into submission. But now, the balance of power was shifting. Her tactics were backfiring, her reputation crumbling, her control slipping. And my farm, the very thing she had tried to erase, was thriving more than ever. Still, I knew Karen well enough to realize she wasn't finished. The lawsuit had failed, the inspections had failed, the gossip had failed. There was only one step left for her to take, one final escalation in her desperate crusade. She was about to make her boldest move yet. By the time autumn rolled around, my farm was more than just a backyard project. It had become a landmark in the neighborhood. The trees I'd planted in spring were beginning to stretch skyward, their leaves tinged with gold and red. The goats had grown into sturdy companions, the chickens clucked out a steady rhythm of eggs, and the bees buzzed tirelessly around the late blooms of the garden. It was a picture of abundance, a small but thriving oasis, but Karen couldn't see the beauty. To her, every leaf, every feather, every grain of soil was a reminder that she was losing control. And Karen wasn't the type to lose gracefully. The first sign of her next move came one Saturday morning when flashing red and blue lights appeared at the edge of my driveway. A police cruiser idled, its engine humming softly as two officers stepped out. Their faces were calm but serious, the kind of look that told me they'd been called to handle a situation. Karen had finally called the police. I walked out to greet them, heart steady but mind racing. I knew everything was in order, but there's always that flicker of uncertainty when authority knocks at your door. Karen appeared from her house almost immediately, striding across the lawn with a look of triumph, her finger pointing accusingly toward my property. She spoke rapidly, her voice shrill and insistent, claiming my animals were dangerous, my farm a hazard, my very presence a threat to the community. She painted a picture of chaos, wild goats trampling yards, bees swarming children, chickens spreading disease. Her words poured out like venom, each accusation sharper than the last. The officers listened patiently, nodding as she spoke. Then finally they turned to me. I invited them into the yard, showing them the goats calmly grazing in their pen, the chickens pecking quietly in their run, the beehive sealed and secure. I explained my setup, my compliance with local laws, the permits and inspections I'd already passed. Every claim Karen made unraveled in the face of reality. The officers took notes, asked a few questions, and even cracked a smile at the sight of neighborhood kids feeding the chickens through the fence. When they left, their report was simple: no violations, no danger, no reason to intervene. Karen stood frozen in her yard, her plan dissolving before her eyes. Her face flushed, her fists clenched. She had expected the police to storm in and shut me down, to drag my farm into chaos. Instead, they had left with nothing but amusement and confirmation that I was fully within my rights. But Karen didn't stop there. The following week, animal control arrived, then the county zoning department, then the health department. Again, Each time they walked the property, inspected every detail, and each time they left empty-handed. My records were flawless, my farm meticulously maintained. What Karen intended as a campaign of destruction was becoming a trail of documented compliance in my favor. And yet, her persistence only grew. She began patrolling the street during the day, taking photos and notes, muttering to herself as she paced. Neighbors started to whisper about her behavior, uneasy with the obsession that had consumed her. Where once she had been feared as the iron fist of the HOA, now she looked less like a leader and more like a woman unraveling under the weight of her own hatred. But Karen wasn't finished escalating. One evening, just as the sun dipped below, the horizon and the farm settled into twilight quiet, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked along the street. Men in suits stood beside them, clipboards in hand. Karen had called in state-level inspectors, stretching her reach far beyond the neighborhood. It was almost impressive, the lengths she was willing to go. The men walked through the farm, with practiced eyes, checking pens, measuring spaces, inspecting feed storage. They were thorough, professional, and relentless. For hours, they combed through every corner of my property, while Karen hovered nearby, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. But when the inspection ended, their conclusion was the same as all the others: no violations. My farm was legal, clean, and fully compliant. Karen's face fell. Her voice rose in protest, demanding they look again, insisting they had missed something, begging them to shut me down. But the inspectors ignored her, packed up their notes, and left without so much as a warning issued. For me, the moment was a turning point. Karen had thrown everything she had at me: fines, lawsuits, gossip, the police, inspectors, and each attempt had crumbled. She was out of weapons, out of leverage, out of control. And yet, even in defeat, I could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't giving up. But here's the thing about battles like this: sometimes, the harder one side fights, the more the other side grows. Because while Karen had been focused on destroying me, I had been focused on building. My farm had doubled in size since that first fine. The greenhouse was thriving, the orchard was taking root, the animals were flourishing. Neighbors who once kept their distance were now regular visitors, bringing their children, trading produce, even volunteering to help with chores. Karen had tried to paint me as an enemy of the community, but instead I had become something else, entirely a cornerstone of it. The shift was subtle at first, but undeniable. Where once Karen's voice had commanded the neighborhood, now laughter, conversation, and the sounds of life spilled from my farm, drowning out her anger. Her isolation grew with each passing day, her influence fading into the background as the community chose growth over control, freedom over fear. Still, I knew Karen wasn't done. A woman like her doesn't fade quietly. If she couldn't win through fines, lawsuits, or authority, then she would resort to something else, something reckless, something desperate, and I had to be ready. The chill of late autumn settled across the neighborhood, and with it came a strange quiet. The leaves had fallen, blanketing yards in amber and red, while the last harvests of my farm filled baskets and storage bins. On the surface, things seemed peaceful, but beneath it all, I could sense the tension. Karen had gone quiet, too quiet. After months of harassment, inspections, and police visits, her silence felt unnatural. Neighbors whispered that maybe she had given up, that maybe she had accepted defeat. But I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. She was the type to scheme in silence, waiting for her next strike. That strike came on a cold, windy night. I was inside when I heard it. The frantic bleating of my goats, the panicked flapping of chickens in their cup. At first, I thought a wild animal had gotten into the yard, but when I rushed outside with a flashlight, the truth became clear. The gate to the goat pen had been unlatched, swinging wide open in the wind. Feed bags had been slashed open, spilling grain across the dirt, A section of fencing had been deliberately cut. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. My heart pounded as I herded the goats back into their pen, calming them with soft words. The chickens, though rattled, were unharmed. Nothing had been stolen, but the intent was obvious. Someone had tried to create chaos, to make it look as if my farm was out of control, and I didn't need to guess who was behind it. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from the security cameras I had quietly installed weeks earlier. Sure enough, there she was, Karen, creeping along the fence line under the cover of darkness, her face twisted in determination as she cut the wire and fumbled with the latch. It was undeniable proof, captured in crystal clarity. For a moment, I was stunned. Karen had gone from petty fines and gossip to outright criminal behavior. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was trespassing, vandalism, and endangerment of animals. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. I took the footage straight to the authorities. The police officer who had once chuckled at my goats now stared grimly at the screen, his pen scratching across a notepad. This wasn't a neighborly dispute anymore. It was a crime. Karen was questioned the very next day. Neighbors watched from their driveways as officers knocked on her door, their presence a silent condemnation of everything she had tried to hide. She denied it, of course, her voice sharp with feigned outrage, but the footage spoke louder than her words. News of her actions spread quickly through the community. The woman who had once prided herself on being the protector of the neighborhood was now exposed as its greatest threat. Parents who had once tolerated her lectures now pulled their children away when she walked by. Residents who had once followed her lead now turned their backs. Her empire of control crumbled in the span of a single day, but even as her reputation shattered, the consequences were still unfolding. The HOA board, long dominated by Karen's influence, called an emergency meeting. This time the agenda wasn't about my farm, it was about her. The evidence of her sabotage, combined with months of harassment and frivolous fines, was enough to spark outrage among even her former allies. She was stripped of her position, her authority gone in a single vote. For Karen, it was the ultimate humiliation. The woman who had built her identity on control and power was suddenly powerless, cast out by the very people she had claimed to serve. Yet even then, she refused to accept defeat. In the weeks that followed, she became a ghostly presence on the street. She lingered near the edges of her property, watching silently as my farm continued to thrive. Her house, once the hub of HOA activity, grew dark and uninviting. Rumors swirled. Some said she was planning to move. Others claimed she was plotting, some last-ditch effort to reclaim control, but I didn't waste time worrying about her. Instead, I focused on growth. The orchard I had planted was beginning to take root, small trees lined in neat rows, promising fruit for years to come. The greenhouse buzzed with life, herbs and vegetables flourishing in the crisp air. The animals thrived, healthy and content, their pens fortified and secure. And the neighbors, they weren't just supportive anymore, they were invested. Families came to help, children learned about farming, and even local schools expressed interest in visiting. What had started as a petty fine had transformed into a community hub. My farm was no longer just mine, it was ours. Karen, meanwhile, faded further into the background. She still watched, still fumed, but her power was gone, her influence shattered. The harder she had fought to destroy me, the more she had destroyed herself. But I knew the story wasn't finished yet. Karen had made one reckless move already, and people like her, when cornered, often made one final desperate attempt to claw their way back. The question wasn't whether she would try again. The question was how. Winter settled over the neighborhood with quiet determination, blanketing roofs with frost and leaving the trees bare and skeletal. My farm, though slowed by the cold, was far from dormant. The greenhouse thrived, glowing warmly at night with its promise of year-round harvests. The goats' thick winter coats kept them cozy in their shelter, the chickens huddled together in their coop, and the bees lay dormant in their hive, waiting for spring. Life was steady, peaceful even. But beneath the calm, I sensed something brewing. Karen hadn't made an appearance in weeks, and for someone like her, silence was never a sign of surrender. It was a warning. Her last desperate attempt came on a night when the wind howled and snow drifted across the cul-de-sac. I was inside, sipping a mug of coffee, when I caught a flicker of motion on my security camera feed. A figure bundled against the cold moved along my fence line with clumsy determination. Even under layers of clothing, I recognized her. Karen. This time, she hadn't come with scissors for the fence or to unlatch a gate. She carried a large trash bag, the outline of something inside shifting awkwardly as she dragged it. My stomach tightened as I watched her haul the bag toward my compost pile. She was dumping garbage onto my property, trying to create the illusion of filth, the kind of evidence she could twist into another attack. But what she didn't realize was that every second of her trespass was being recorded in high definition. The next morning, I called the police once again, this time with undeniable proof of repeated criminal behavior. Officers arrived promptly, and within hours, Karen was placed under formal investigation for trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. Unlike before, when she could hide behind complaints and accusations, this time there was no escape. The footage told the story better than words ever could. Her arrest was quiet but devastating. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as officers escorted her from her home. The woman who had once strutted down the street with an air of authority now looked small, defeated, her empire of intimidation crumbling completely. From that point on, the story shifted. Karen's obsession became nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors. She eventually moved out, selling her house at a loss, unable to face the community she had once tried to dominate. Her name became synonymous with overreach and pettiness, a reminder of how power can consume a person until there's nothing left. For me, the farm stood as proof that resilience could outlast control. Spring returned, and with it came blossoms on the orchard trees, buzzing bees, and fresh sprouts from the greenhouse. The farm grew into something larger than I had ever imagined. What started with a handful of chickens and a $200 fine had become a thriving community hub. Neighbors gathered for seasonal harvests, children learned about gardening and animals, and the once quiet cul-de-sac transformed into a place alive with laughter and connection. Looking back, I realized Karen had done more to build the farm than she had to destroy it. Her harassment, her fines, her desperate attacks, all of it had fueled my determination to expand, to prove her wrong, to fight harder. Without her, my farm might have remained a small hobby. Because of her, it became something extraordinary. And as I walked through the orchard one bright morning, the sun glinting through branches heavy with blossoms, I couldn't help but smile. Karen had set out to break me. Instead, she had built me. The farm was stronger than ever, the community closer than ever, and Karen, once the voice of the HOA, was nothing more than a distant memory. The battle was over, and I had won.